Okay, continuing on in our Civil 3D Bridge Design series. In the last video, we created a general assembly for our roadway following our typical section and created just a very basic corridor, which we have here. We discussed in the previous video some adjustments that needed to be made to the corridor, specifically at the beginning and the end. Where we may not have surface profile, but we have alignment, so we'll need to snip that up. And I also want to talk through some other corridor properties that are essential to the design process, and how to split regions, how to add different typical sections, etc. So the first thing I just want to point out, I'm gonna freeze this for a second, kind of what our aim is here. So we have picked a bridge. We decided on a 60-foot PC span bridge, and I have gone in since the last video and provided a guardrail design. So this is a guardrail connection to our bridge abutments here, and we have the standard spacing, and then it flares out, and then we have a turn down anchor unit here. This cyan line represents our widening, so our guardrail widening, so 5 feet here, and then we continue that past the anchor unit about 20 feet, and then we have a 14:1 taper to match what will be our existing shoulder, so the lane width, the full lane width and shoulder. And so I've copied that for all the way across. And so one of the things we're going to be doing in this video is moving our typical section to where it follows these widening extensions and different features. But the first thing, so I'll turn the corridor layer back on. The first thing we mentioned was, you see how there's a little gap here between where the alignment begins and the profile begins. So a quick way to adjust our corridor is using these grip edits. Now you'll notice these grip edits are a little bit different than those for a line. They're this cyan color and kind of a diamond shape, but those will be the grip edits that will show up for corridors. So we can just manually drag this, and then I have a line drawn here. Let's scoot this over. Right where the project begins, where the profile begins. And again, this is our profile. So we set an alignment just a little bit further back to provide a full straight line, but we don't always use every bit of it. We could technically draw our line all the way back, but we wouldn't have a typical section there as well because we're not beginning construction there. So the profile, the finished grade profile, is just the construction center line. Okay, and so we also have a little bit to snip off on the back end. Another way to do that, and to introduce you to the idea of the corridor properties dialog box, when you click on your corridor, you have a whole new ribbon pop up that has all kind of useful tools for your corridor. The first thing we'll look at, we'll just click this corridor properties, and so this has been expanded in recent versions of Civil 3D, and really contains everything, and you can do everything in here as far as your corridor updating and editing goes. So right here we have our baselines, and then this is our regions, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but we only have one region right now. We adjusted our start station manually, and you can see that reflected here. So we can either do the same thing, manually drag it, or for our end station, or we can type it in here and hit apply. And so now we need to rebuild the corridor. Okay, I'm going to show you. So see, it snipped this off. So one thing to note on corridors, if you come in your tool space over here, and now we have corridors, and you have this one, okay? If you come over, and there's a couple options. So anytime you edit a corridor, essentially remember it's a 3D model of our roadway. And so any edits you make, it needs to rebuild this 3D model. So you can either manually do it one at a time, or you can click rebuild automatic. And so you see now that's checked. So every time you do an edit, it just automatically goes through and updates your corridor. Okay, instead of having to ask you or prompt you, or you have to manually go do it. And so this is our corridor. This is our typical section all the way down as a single region. But as we move through, we may want to split different regions. And the reason for doing this is maybe you have a different typical section. So in the case of the bridge is does not include the daylight links and the slope links. It is just a bridge. And we actually have a separate typical section that will show the depth of the beams as well, to kind of provide a better idea there. So real quick, we could go through and split that region, but I want to just real quick kind of introduce a few of the other concepts for corridors, the main ones. So there's regions, and you have kind of this modifying region section of your corridor tab. So you can split regions, add regions, merge regions, copy, etc. And another thing you see here is edit frequency. If you'll note, there's lines in here, these horizontal lines, and these are similar to section views or sample lines. When it creates this corridor, it's not creating a seamless model all the way across. It is, but the way it does it is by sampling every 25 feet is the standard, creating essentially a cross section there and then connecting them. We can tighten that up if we need to. We can make this a 10 foot, 5 foot to provide a lot more detail, and we'll do that here in just a minute. The reasoning for doing that is when we need more specific details, so say right around the abutments here, or to clean this area up where the widening starts. And a lot of times between regions, you'll have a transition period that you'll want a lot higher frequency or smaller difference between the sample areas. But the reason against doing this on a small project like this, on a relatively new computer, this isn't that big of a file or object as far as data storage, data capacity. But if you had a multi-mile road, sampling every 25 feet already creates a fairly hefty CAD object as far as data storage and manipulation. So every time you go to edit that, when it rebuilds, it's got to resample all of that. So if you had a really tight frequency, like 10 feet across multiple miles, it can take a very, very long time to load, very long time to work, and may not actually work sometimes. So that's something to keep in mind as far as frequency. We'll talk about targets in a minute, but briefly, your targets are and I believe we discussed this briefly in the last video, when we set features outside of our lanes, and even our lanes, the edges of our lanes, remember there was those markers, all these markers, well, they can be tied to specific features within our drawing, within our design, both surfaces as well as polyline or feature line features that can adjust how these subassemblies operate. Okay, so that's what targets are. So, save here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to split the region for the bridge. We see how it's showing a daylight slope way out here into the creek, and obviously across the span of the bridge we're not having any daylight slope. And And so what we're going to do is split the region. I've got it drawn in here. So this yellow polygon here, that's our bridge deck. And so we're going to split this corridor based on that. So we can come up here and split region. And so now it says select a region to split. Now we only have one region total, but it's still, that's the process. So we select that, and then you specify the location of where we're going to split it. So we want to split it at the first deck location. Okay, and so now we actually have, if we back up a little bit, we have two regions now. We have one on this side and one over here. But we actually want to separate the entire deck from the roadway, and so we're going to need to split it again on this side. So again, now it's asking for a region to split, and we actually have two to pick from, but we're going to pick this one over here and then come right at the edge of the deck and split it. And now we have three independent regions that we can manipulate. And if we go to our corridor properties, you'll now see there are three different regions within our alignment or horizontal baseline. So we know this one in the middle is now going to be our bridge. Oops. We can do it here. What we can do now is change the assembly within that region. We can rename this region bridge, and we can put in this typical for the bridge. And here we can actually update our frequency. And so you can change your frequency based on multiple baseline features. It's better if you're going to change it, just change it for all of them, and that way you know it's working. But you can have it set differently along curves, along tangents, and sometimes that's really helpful for your horizontal geometry to have maybe a higher frequency along curves, but then along tangents or straight lines, leave it to be longer. So we're going to reduce the frequency on the bridge to 10 feet, and we changed our assembly. So we're going to hit OK. And note, this time it rebuilt the corridor by itself, and you'll see now we have a bridge section with no shoulders, no daylight, and then we have our roadway sections on each side. One cool thing you can do now that you have a 3D model for your corridor, if you go up to View and Orbit, let's take section, now you can actually see a 3D model of your roadway. Now you'll note something right in here. You see how this end shoots straight down to nothing, or to zero. And this is a good indicator. If you'll recall, we moved that back to match the profile, but that means I didn't type in the exact right number, and so it's going just a little bit past where it has profile information for the elevation, so it immediately just sends it down to zero. So we can adjust that here, and maybe I'll just scoot it down and see if I can snap it right there, and I bet that probably solved the problem. Yep. So now we have this is our 3D corridor. And this is helpful to be able to view it in 3D sometimes, because sometimes we really lose sense of how we're doing it. We can see our plan view, we can see our 2D sections, which we'll create later, but being able to see and interpret this, that you can see from the beginning we're in a cut scenario where we're having to cut a ditch and come around, and then as we get to the bridge, now we're filling here, and then we come back into a cut section here. So and that helps inform what it looks like. Okay, so I'll save this. So this is our initial base edit. So another thing that is really important to do when you're creating, once you have created your corridor, there's a lot more adjustments that will come, and we can work on those in just a minute. But the first thing I want to do is to create corridor surfaces. So we're going to go to corridor properties and come over to surfaces. And real quick, so we have our existing ground surface that we got from the topo survey, and that's what we're basing most of our design on. But as we are making this 3D model of our roadway corridor, we want to know the specific information as far as the top of our surface, the bottom, the datum of our surface, and that will help guide volume calculations, and that will be the information essentially that is built into our section views. So we want to create both a top and a bottom surface, or a datum surface, for our corridor. So we want to first come in, and this button on the far left is create a corridor surface. And so now we've created the corridor. We can rename it, and I always like to name it top, or something like that. So corridor top. So the surface style, this will be how it displays. I'm just going to turn it off for now. And so a couple other things. We want to have an overhang correction. This is going to be our top, so we set it to top links. But another thing we need to do is add the actual links. So the data type, we want it to be the links, and the code is top. Okay, and then we hit the plus button, and now we have our surface, and then this is the links that it uses to create it. We also want to check this button to add as a break line, and this will be important, and this is very important when you're thinking about especially a curved alignment. But as a straight line, it's still important, and it basically says the outer bounds of the corridor are automatically added as a break line for the surface, and so it doesn't try to extract data from outside of that boundary. So we're going to hit apply, and then we also want to create a second one that is our datum. So we'll go and add another surface. This time it's going to be datum. Again, we don't want to display it. You can choose to display it, and that's fine. We'll double check that they have been created in a second. This time the bottom links are going to be used, and we want to select datum. So if you notice, you can choose any link that in any of the subassemblies that you have created to make these, and there may be reasons for doing that, but for right now all we need is the top and the datum. So again, we're going to do that, and we will check OK. And so now if we go look in our surfaces, we have two new surfaces. We have our existing ground, which we previously had established, and now we have a corridor datum and top. And one way to check, I'm going to turn our corridor off, and now I want to display the top. And I like to use just contours and triangles for doing this, because you get a good idea of exactly where it is. And you see how it follows pretty closely with where our corridor was. Okay, but now we have an actual surface for this. And this will come in really essential when we're doing our section views later. So the last thing I do want to cover in here, let me save real quick, is, I'll turn the corridor back on, is targeting using the corridor. So we had mentioned that we drew this line, and this was going to be our widening for the guardrail. But if you note, right now the lanes for our corridor just follow that base typical section, but we want to widen them out based on this line. So what we can do is edit targets. We can select a region, so we're going to start down here. So you can also do this directly through corridor properties. We hit OK, and now we have this target mapping dialog box. This is a lot different than it used to be. Some people think it's a lot more complicated, and it is in a way, but it's all directly here. You don't have to click each link one at a time. You don't have to specify all of that. It's all built into this one dialog box, but it can get kind of overwhelming to look at sometimes. So what we're wanting to do right now is we want to actually extend the edge of the lane to the width that we specified there. And so we have our subassemblies linked here, and we want to click our lanes. So now we have a width target. So, and you'll have to really keep track here versus right versus left. And so our width target on the right, and we want to set it. Now there's a couple options. Over here it will show all your any alignments or pipes that you could target. Over here it shows feature lines, and it gives you different options for existing lines. But I like to go and select it from the drawing, so I'm going to click here, and I actually want to select this polyline. And I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to hit OK for now and see what it does. Now if you notice, and it automatically rebuilt, we have extended our lane to follow that widening width. Now we have a little bit of issue up here, and I think it's because this polyline actually came back in, and probably those should have been two separate polylines. So let me actually just freeze that for a second. I'm going to remove that vertex, and we'll draw that back in later. And now if we double check our corridor, now that basically fits in there. It's pretty similar, but this is where we'll need to adjust a few things, because if you note, this line only went to here and stopped, whereas our region goes all the way here. But our widening stops here, and actually we have a smaller width in here between these two abutments. So that brings up a good point. What we actually need to do is create a new region that will just be between the abutments here. So we can easily do that. We could just split this region, and we can split it right there at the end. And now we could actually edit this region and remove that polyline. So uncheck that, and we could actually set this polyline to be our width. Hit OK. Now one thing we'll note, and this will require a bit more work down the line, now we can set this width, but if you see how it angles in, it's because the frequency isn't very high in this region. Now we could edit that and tighten it up and even say 5 feet. Okay, and that would tighten it up pretty good. But we still have that little jump right here at the end. But another thing is, within this region between the abutments, we'll actually need a separate typical section that doesn't include the slopes and the width coming off of the edge of the pavement, because we have our concrete guardrail here. So that'll be something additional that we'll have to do later. But in essence, that's how we're going to target this widening, how we're going to add that to and create our full lanes and make it follow this line. So another thing to check, if we look at our targets, and we need to verify that we're actually targeting a surface. So if we didn't set this, and I believe we did set it when we created the corridor, but we need to make sure it's targeting a surface, especially for our daylight. Now it doesn't always, so our daylight will show up here in the surface. But that's another thing just to make sure that it's actually doing. Otherwise, you're not getting the full width of the corridor. So we're not going to do it here, but essentially the process now is to go through, target each of these widening polylines. We'll widen our corridor throughout these regions. We'll need a little bit of work creating a new assembly for this small region between the abutments, and being able to target its edges here. But that gives you a pretty good overview and good idea for how corridor properties work, how to create surfaces from your corridor. And for the most part, that's going to be a lot of what you're doing, is splitting the corridor, creating different regions, having different typical sections, and that'll help you build your model all the way across. There will be more complicated things as you move forward, targeting different features like driveways, creating kind of like an intersection for the driveway, using pipe networks and different things like that. But for now, that's a pretty good basic overview of the corridor properties. So I think that'll be it for this video.